Welcome to our part three in the USPCA's 2024 series on effective police canine supervision. Uh, we're going to talk about building a successful canine culture today. What are the ingredients that go into it? What does one look like? And we have a panel of experts here that I'm absolutely overjoyed I get to spend time with on a regular basis, working with this in the United States Police Canine Association Best Practices Working Group. We got Don Slavic, Executive Director of the USPCA, John Kerwick, who, as a captain with NYPD Transit, had maintained a large contingent of working canines. Gene Ramirez, who is the attorney who represents the USPCA, and a bunch of law enforcement officers facing legal challenges on this job. He is internationally known as an expert on the topic of use of force and the constitutional constraints on the use of force. David Furlan, affectionately known as Lou by us, and the professor, is with us too. He's got a class full of students, so you'll see that on his screen. You'll see a bunch of smiling faces there. They are in a law enforcement class. Mark Darnell, former chief deputy from Minnesota, and one of those unique people who managed to keep a dog all the way throughout his career in the sheriff's office. Chris Butterfield, who's trainer for Tulsa PD. Chris is an experienced canine handler and trainer who, supervisor, sergeant, who understands what it is to run a unit, because he's been there when there's been more and less effective supervision. So he's doing his best, constantly trying to improve, and he's a joy to have in the working group. Melinda Rope is here, as she is the secretary for the United States Police Canine Association. And that rounds out the people that are regularly part of our group. The rest of you are attendees, and we look forward to having this conversation unfold. And what we're going to do is throw up a PowerPoint, not as a content delivery mechanism, but more as a kind of a table of contents for the way the conversation will unfold. So as we start going through this, we want to talk about canine cultures, and essentially, it's fair to say that a thing is defined by what it does. And so we're looking for what canine cultures do. We want things that preserve the viability of canine serving the whole world, not just our communities, but the law enforcement community everywhere. Canines provide something that can't be replaced, and we want to make sure that we keep that viable and serve our communities in the way that they want and the way they need. We got to make sure that we build and maintain trust. That means we have to be responsive to the way things are unfolding to us as we go. The easiest way to do that is to engage in regular self-critical analysis, for us to see where our strengths and weaknesses are, and then capitalize on opportunities and manage the threats that our organization faces. And that means we got to stay ahead of the curve. Being proactive is the key to avoiding problems. There is no better cure than prevention. So that's what we're looking at. How do we prevent the bad things from happening? By building a really strong canine culture. What it's not, don't think of canine as an adjunct duty for a patrol officer. They're 80% of the time shagging calls, and only 20% of the time they're focused on canine. That's a really tough thing to maintain. The dog is always learning. And if the bulk of its time is not spent in that learning process, performance will degrade, the team will degrade, and you're going to run into problems. So we don't think that canine should be just an adjunct thing. We want somebody who's truly dedicated. You want to find handlers that are truly dedicated, supervisors that are fully committed to supporting that dedication. We don't want a canine culture that's bite-centric. By that, I mean, it's not about the bite. It's about the find. There's nothing that the dog has that's irreplaceable except the nose. We're the only tool in the law enforcement inventory that can actually, put its nose on the ground at the local stop and rob, track 5 blocks through the city, and find the suspect hiding underneath some innocent family's back deck. Nothing else can do that. And that's why this is a valuable tool. If you have to use the dog as a tool of force, that's a secondary consideration. We want canine cultures that focus on evolving. And therefore, if you're stagnant, if you rest on your laurels, that's a real problem. I know I have made that mistake. And all of a sudden, we saw the rest of the community pass us by and we had to play catch up. It's also not an egocentric thing. You don't want egocentric handlers. You don't want egocentric canine people. You want people that are committed to the betterment of canine and its service to the department and to the community. And that means a lot of time you got to put your egos to the side. It's not about just what you want. Sometimes you're going to have to give this job demands more of you than you're probably going to get paid for as a handler. And you got to find people who are comfortable with that. And you have to find supervisors who are not only comfortable with that, but who also will not unfairly take advantage of it. So while we're on that thing here, we're going to talk about what makes a good canine officer. You want the consummate professional. That's why you want somebody who's been on the street long enough for you to have seen their work product and be very comfortable with what they're capable of, not just their tactical work, but also their interaction with people on a day-to-day basis, both in and out of the department. And you also want somebody that really knows how to do the job, doesn't have to think a lot about a lot of the nuts and bolts pieces, because when they get the dog there, that's going to occupy their attention. So all the rest of this stuff has to be kind of built into muscle memory, good tactics and true professionals. You want somebody who is judicious. And in that regard, we want somebody who, as the city said and was quoted by many military leaders here, of all manifestations of power, restraint impresses men most. And that's what we want. We want people who are judicious and understand that they have a very powerful tool and that they can exercise restraint in its use. We want people who have a strong sense of ethics and character and will go ahead and do the right thing, even when it's uncomfortable. And again, I circle back around that professional piece. You want somebody that everybody in your department goes, oh yeah, that's a good cop. That's the kind of person when they walk into the roll call door, everybody knows that person's going to handle their beat. Everything's going to be fine. Those are the people you want to bring in. And everybody has a job here when it comes to building this canine culture. It's important that whoever you have managing the unit and supervising the unit, manager, let's say lieutenant level, supervisor, sergeant level, they are knowledgeable about canine enough to know what really needs to be done. And if they've never been a canine handler, then they need to go ahead and figure out how to get that outside knowledge, and the USPCA can point you towards certain resources along with this webinar series. It's really important that you wind up with a quality trainer. And this is something that takes skill outside the department. You've got to go ahead and see how other people do things and not just try them willy-nilly, but actually have a judicious eye about why do they do that? What makes sense? They got to be curious as a trainer. They have to have the adequate skills to be there. And you have to have the trainer understand his or her job is not to fix the problem. His or her job is to be a resource for the handlers, because the handlers are only the ones who are with that dog 24/7, 365. And that the trainer will help give them a training plan that they get to execute. And yet you have to understand that the handlers have to understand that that's important, because their job is one that they don't understand. And the handlers have to adopt a trainer's mindset, because that is the case, because there's no way a trainer can be with everybody often enough to always handle everything that comes up. These handlers have to think like trainers to be effective at their job. And if you look at this, this sounds like we're asking a lot of a lot of different people. That means the support from the executive level in the department has to be really, really strong. You have to have a chief, an assistant chief that truly understand what this unit needs. And if it's a small agency, whether it's a small sheriff's office or a small municipal department, it's important that that executive educate himself or herself about the roles that this canine handler can best perform for their agency. It's a little different when you got a big city and there's lots of backup and things like that. And then when you got somebody that's in a small one-horse town. And so understand the limitations and the advantages and try and harness them effectively. The building blocks of this canine culture are really, really important. One of the things that you have to understand is that the first thing that comes out of this is policies. Before we started this webinar, we were talking, and I was reminded of times when a policy was created, some of the handlers went, grown, oh no, a new policy, and it means more work. But after they did it for a few months, all of a sudden they realized that it made their life easier. So having good policies and effective policies that are well written, clearly understood, and that you train to them, you understand and you operate within those policies, life gets better. That means you got to know what you want to accomplish. Operational goals are important. What do we want our dogs to do? Where are our strengths? You don't want to spend 80% of your time focusing on 20% of enhancements that don't do anything. In other words, spend your time on the things that matter most and then be very clear about what you expect. Procedures, how those goals are accomplished. Everybody at every level should have their procedures clearly spelled out. The handler should know what's expected of them. The sergeant should know what's expected of them. These need to be written in such a way that everybody knows their job, all the way up past the sergeant, through the lieutenant, the captain, all the way up to the chief, or all the way up to the sheriff. It's important to understand that everybody has to not only know what to do, but they should probably know how to do the job of the person above them, because that helps them know what the expectations being placed on them are. So it's really important to make sure that these procedures are clearly spelled out, and we go from there. Finally, you got to have some kind of accountability model. Every department has something, but it's important because, it goes back, we're biblical here for a second, because to whom much is given, much is expected. And so this canine tool is one of the most powerful, useful tools we've got. And so we're going to hold people who have this dog to a higher standard. We should realize, and maybe that can't be built into the department's rules. So the culture of the canine unit has to do that, because departments have to apply rules equally across the board. But within our culture, we can hold each other and ourselves accountable in a way that really builds this canine culture rock solid and sustainable. And I'm going to say a key to this is every good leader should probably plan to have at least 3 people ready to step in and fill the gap if they go down, or if they retire, or if they wind up taking a vacation. It's important to have people come in here and not be able to have things fall through the cracks while you're done. So succession planning is an absolutely critical piece of maintaining the canine culture that you build so carefully. And this is the thing you have to understand. There is nothing more powerful than training when it comes to building a canine unit. And so your commitment to constant improvement through training has to be absolute across the board for everybody. Everybody has to really be committed to it, not just show up and put in the time. This is about constantly finding the edges of performance and gradually pushing them out. I think I'll throw this up and we'll come back to it later on. I'll come off the screen. This is our roadmap. We've already talked about supervisory nuts and bolts and core competencies. You can find those on the USPCA's YouTube channel. And today we're talking about building a successful canine culture. And next November, we're going to wind up talking about the USPCA's the Best Practice Work Group 5-year plan, where we want to help shape the canine community, particularly USPCA, but everywhere else that we can possibly have some influence. Coming up 5 years, how can we see where canine can be in 5 years from now, not where we're stuck? With that, I'm going to go ahead and stop the presentation and return it to the panel. Don, the ball is in your hands.
Thanks, Steve. There's a lot of great points that you gave and put out there. Some seem to be every webinar we do, they have some of the same things in there. Culture is huge with police canine and police in general. And culture, you can have the greatest department, greatest canine program, but there are other cultures that your canine handlers will interact with from time to time, and you have to be aware of what those cultures are doing to the people that you have. And we're just talking about some people have a different idea how you should deploy your dog. You have to work on the policies, and you have to do that. David, Lou?
And culture might deviate from that policy. So, you know, we're going over criminal law here, and we know that police policies can sometimes be more restrictive than what criminal law allows. And then how does a culture differ from the police policy? An example of how those three might be in play and how they might be different.
Well, I'll deal with the policy issue differing from the law. So let's say the law says you should call your dog off as soon as you determine it is safe to call the dog off. In other words, as soon as you see the suspect's hands, you determine he's not a threat, you should call your dog off. Some agencies have that policy. Another agency may have a policy is, well, I want that suspect to bring my dog to me, which is going to take a period of time. And there's some recent cases saying the length of time that your dog is on the bite can be a separate constitutional violation, separate and apart from whether the initial deployment and bite was constitutionally justified. So there may be an example of this is what the law says, but your policy may be something that differs from the law, and it's going to come up if you get sued, and it's going to be debated in court, and you may not go to jail for it, but you may have an issue where you may pay money damages to an injured suspect because their policy was different from the law. So hopefully that was clear. That's how it could come up in policy versus law. I'll let Steve or the others deal with the issue of culture.
I'll jump in here since you threw my name into it, Gene. And I will say the cultural piece of this, why we talk about policies, is because you have to have a framework on which to build, a skeleton to flesh out, right? And those policies are that framework. They say, here's the structure. This is the way things are supposed to go. And as Gene pointed out, many departments will have policies that are more restrictive than the law requires. All right. And a part of that is the idea about being proactive and about being responsive to our community. Some communities expect you to be maybe a little more restricted than the law would allow. And so this creates what the policy is designed to do is to create a uniformity of behavior. And what culture does, if you build a culture correctly, is it creates a uniformity of values built around those behaviors that the policy writes. So what you're trying to do is get people to value the idea. Yes, this is the way we do it here. This is the way. This is our way of best serving our community, and this is a hard thing because cultures can form in unwanted ways if you're not careful. But by providing those clear policies with written operational goals and clear procedures about how things are to be done, you get people into the habit. And like I said, the classic example, and I'll tell what it was, is we started, our department said, before any time you go on a search for somebody, whether you have a dog or not, there should be a tactical briefing, just a pre-deployment brief that says, this is what we're trying to accomplish, who does what. And that policy at first was one that people just kind of forgot about because everybody just went out and chased somebody when they had to. But after they started doing it for a while, they realized that having that pre-deployment briefing actually made things go more smoothly during the operation. And after a while, they started enhancing those briefings, not just the patrol officers, but the canine officers specifically. And it made life much, much better. That was something that happened organically. And that's what culture does. It makes organic changes. It takes the imposed changes that maybe a policy or a law will give you. And then it, for lack of I'm going to make up a word, it organifies them and makes just the way people think about it, just the way they operate. And that makes things a lot easier for you to maintain. Once everybody goes, oh yeah, this is the way we do things. You've got to constantly keep checking on it and make sure you're keeping up with the current stuff. But that's where I see the culture piece on this. Moving on.
Thank you guys very much. Listen, I'm going to sign out so you guys can have your discussion. I just wanted to thank you for letting the class come in, get a chance to see what a police webinar looks like, meet you guys. We were talking, I had the microphone off, so we were talking a little bit during your presentation, Steve, about different things. Gene, I think that was a terrific example of policy and law. And Steve, I love that positivity of how you build culture around the policy. I think that's a terrific piece of this. So anyway, thank you guys. We'll sign out, and I hope everybody's safe.
Thanks, Lou. Y'all take care.
Steve, I think it's important for the people attending this to understand that when we had these webinars for handlers, and we talked about they should train their dog to their policy and the laws and et cetera, et cetera. And then when asked how many people know what's in their canine policy, how many people did not know? And this is huge. When we did not realize this, and this is why we're kind of preaching a little bit here to the supervisors, is that they must know their policy, because when they go to court, if something happens, whether it's good or it's bad, but they're questioned, they train to the policy of their department. And police departments, sheriff's offices, they all have different things in their policies for canines that they want to do. The administrators put things in there as this is how we want them to operate. So when they're training, they need to train for what they're supposed to be doing for their department. And that is sometimes where culture comes in during that training. So I just thought I'd mention that.
And actually, I was going to throw this to you, John, so I'm glad you raised your hand. Hit it, brother. I think I know where you're going.
So, hi, everybody, and thanks for the presentation, Steve. The culture part of this whole thing is something that's created over time. We create a policy, we put it into effect with a date that starts it, we train to it, and we get it done. But that culture that was in the past still can stick its feet into our present policy just because we're human beings. So I think this applies to more than just canine. If we have a culture that is bite-centric, for instance, that we've resolved all our problems by having more bites or having not a lot of regulations as to how we did things, that culture is still going to be there. Speaking from personal experience over the years, the culture of my original trainers was totally different than the culture of my second set of trainers, and in today's world, in my set of thinking, and that's where we should be at with our canine handlers. To change the culture is more than just pushing a button and putting in a new policy. So the way to accomplish that, in my best experience, is the people we select, all of them, the handlers themselves, very important, the sergeants, the lieutenants, everyone in that chain of command for a canine unit is so imperative. We could have the best 10 handlers and have the worst sergeant or have a mediocre lieutenant or whatever, and that will influence the entire unit, especially when you get to command staff as well. So I'm not picking on supervisors. This applies to, I think, all of police work and probably business too. If we have someone in the middle there who's a roadblock to new policy and adhering to it and good thinking about it, making it work for the department, we're going to have problems. Remember, the canine unit doesn't serve the community itself. It serves the police department, which serves the community. So we don't run our own little show here. We answer to the police department, patrol, and what they need. We're there to serve them. We get our calls through patrol usually. And that's who we should be keeping in mind and how we serve it. And the police department itself, of course, serves the community. But the issue we have sometimes is that we pick less than our best pick of people at all ranks. It shows up real bad on the handler side when we pick someone who's not qualified, and it shows up even more so on the supervision side. But to have the ideal canine handler in my world, I need to have somebody who's super committed. He doesn't have to be a dog scientist and understand dog behavior to the maximum. Like we'd like that, but it's just a small portion of things. But we need a guy who has the assets that you mentioned in the beginning, Steve, and we need someone who's got commitment. This is not like taking a guy and training him for highway or a supervisor or anyone at any rank. This is a 24/7 commitment. And I think executive leadership fails to realize that these guys have to be committed. They have to be willing to have that environment in their house done right. They have to be willing to make sure the dog is okay at work and constantly training. And also, without going out on a limb too much, the best canine handlers, the best canine supervisors I've met live and breathe canine. And if you can put the bulk of your unit into that category, you will have one of the best canine units out there. So as an executive leader or as command staff leadership should actually understand, you can't pick canine people like you pick detectives. I think it's very unfortunate. The negativity that's going to come out of a bad pick in a canine supervisor or canine handler is going to cost your department millions, literally, as Gene can probably tell you. So that culture you're going to create there is not good. You have to have a hardworking, very committed person at all ranks. And if you're just picking a mediocre guy who watches the clock, your culture is going to be very, very negative. And I hope that helped. Thanks.
Melinda, your hands up. What you got?
Yeah, thank you guys for doing this webinar. It's awesome. I wanted to point out, I feel like I'm always negative Nancy sometimes with all this stuff, but culture can be positive as well. We talk about how the culture plays a negative role, and it does. There's no question about that. But I think we also need to remember and emphasize with our handlers, those of us that are trainers and supervisors, I spent a lot of time building the positive culture, building on the ones that are doing it right. And then, of course, dealing with the ones that don't do it right. But culture can be positive, and you can have one person come in and flip it. And I love that. That's very powerful for any unit within the police department. So I just wanted to mention that.
I think that's the goal of this whole thing, is trying to develop a culture that continually contributes as opposed to degrades. And that's what we're all about with this conversation. And I'm going to throw something in on this concept too. I don't know of any way to better build a culture around policy than to train to that policy. Figure out what tactics are driven by that policy, and then everybody gets together and you do that. And here's one of the things I think is really important. I know that we've got a few people here. It looks like we've got some supervisors here. Just nod your head or do a hand raise if you've ever seen patrol officers or patrol deputies abandon the tactics that they've been taught because of what's happening with the dog. You ever see them all of a sudden rush to hurry to do something that they wouldn't do otherwise because all of a sudden there's a dog attached to somebody or a dog is going someplace that they want to go follow up? I see it all the time. So this is one of the beautiful places where you can build this culture by training and bringing those patrol officers in a little bit, a few here and there, to help do what they would do. And then they start to get the benefit of this culture you're trying to build in the canine unit about adherence to tactics that are endorsed or provided by the department, and that we're going to help you stick with them as opposed to drag you out of them. I've watched good canine handlers abandon the tactics they were trained in because they were so busy watching their dog and not paying attention. So this is one of those things that really becomes something that unifies people and builds that kind of good culture that you want, is that group training where it's actually built around what the department expects you to do, not just what the coolest thing that you learned when you went to the HITS conference in Louisiana. So just my 2 cents on that. We talked about what an effective canine culture does. And I think first and foremost on that was, preservation of canines' viability serving our communities. But I think the other big pieces of a good canine culture that Melinda's describing is we're always looking for the gaps and the shortfalls and the edges of performance and trying to build it out. And can somebody, Chris or somebody in the group, talk about what you do to keep your unit proactive about making sure that you're preventing problems rather than trying to patch them?
Yeah. So in our unit, we train every Wednesday. Half of our guys train, say today, and the other half train the next week. The lieutenant and I always make a point to be there for training, and we talk about policy all the time because I don't know. It just seems like these days policy is changing all the time. And our canine policy, it's stayed pretty consistent and pretty much the same, but our use of force policy has changed. Oh, I don't know how many times in the past couple of years, a bunch. So we're always going over policy, and we're always going over things like pursuit policy because, you know, with our unit, our dogs are deployable on felony crimes. So that would involve pursuits. So at least pursuits with stolen vehicles. So we're always going over pursuits, and I know pursuits are very under the microscope right now. So we're always talking about that. We're always going over, at least every week, we go over body cam footage of our own body cam footage of bites and apprehensions and what could we have done different. And our guys are very open to that. And matter of fact, we have a relatively young squad right now. So a lot of our guys don't know life without a body camera. So when we watch their deployments and their apprehensions, they're real good about the constructive criticism. So we do that a lot. And even if it was a great deployment, a great apprehension, we still will say, well, is there anything we could have done different? We have a real open dialogue. The lieutenant and I both are very open door policy, you know, that kind of stuff. And within the unit, we also have 3 trainers. And, you know, as Steve mentioned earlier, our trainers aren't really there to solve the problem. They're there to help you solve the problem. So they're obviously very open to dialogue and to any kind of constructive criticism, because let's be honest, we could all improve and be better all the time. None of us are perfect. So open communication, open dialogue, not being too sensitive to any kind of criticisms is vital. But and as Steve mentioned earlier too, and he did a great job in introducing all this, is we're ever evolving. I mean, I've been a part of this unit now for over 16 years, and it is so different than, and at 16 years, really in the grand scheme is not that long, but the changes that have taken place in that 16 years are many and pretty significant. So you have to always be thinking ahead constantly, especially nowadays with all the cameras and all the eyes out there. We kind of just have our own little internal belief. Look, just always know you're on camera. You are actually, you got your own camera, but you're always on camera no matter what you're doing. So just treat it like that and you'll be okay. But that's kind of how we try to get back to your original question there, Steve, try to be proactive about getting in front of issues that could arise is trying to always talk about what we could be doing better and kind of critiquing one another.
So Chris, can I ask you to expand on one component of this? Like when you guys get together for your group training on alternate Wednesdays, is one of the pieces of the policy instruction, the policy component of this, giving officers, putting them in situations where they got to make a decision? Is this or is this not in compliance with policy? Am I in or out of policy if I'm going to do something with my dog here?
Yes. And as a matter of fact, that's how we'll open it a lot of times, rather than, we'll open it with, okay, let's say with a scenario, let's say this, and this happens and you use your dog. Are you within policy? To your point. We do that a lot. And again, it's very interactive. You know, we want guys to even argue with it so that we can get deeper into it and tell them why. This is why that policy is in place. And even beyond the canine, the use of the canine, obviously that's a big one because we're the canine unit. So it's like, when can we use the dog? When can we not? In this scenario, can we? But where we're seeing a lot of things right now is with pursuits, and that's one we've been hitting here lately. That's kind of why I've been using that example. We've been really hitting on that because, again, in our department, the two kind of can go hand in hand. We can't deploy on the pursuit alone, but if there's any other felony that goes with it, we can. So say stolen car, or even if there's not a felony, we find a gun in the car, we can articulate using the dog. So yes, we will set up scenarios, and I remember being a young officer in the unit too, and thinking, well, why can't I use the dog? I mean, and a lot of our guys will do that. So, and again, I like that because I like that they're asking those questions, because at least then I know they're engaged. You know, their mind is open. They're learning. So, yeah, we do it all the time, Steve. I mean, our squad's always talking.
Do you ever, in the middle of a scenario, change the circumstances? So now they got to make a decision. Am I still in compliance with policy?
All the time,
Right.
because as we know, police work, canine work, police, all of it is fluid. I mean, it's always changing and moving, and you know, there is no black and white. There, you know, and to go back to what you were saying earlier about, and what John was saying about picking people, obviously you want people who are going to mix well with your squad, good chemistry, good people, good cop. But usually what goes along with that's a good decision maker, and good decision making is vital. I mean, it's probably the number one quality you need to have to be in this unit. So that's something we look for. And when we're looking for people too, I was thinking about this while John was talking. The reputation of the officer goes a long way as well. And, you know, to what you were talking about, Steve, when they walk in the room, that's a good cop. Typically what goes along with that are all the good things, you know, probably a good decision maker also. So decision making so key, because as you said, it can change. The scenario can change like that. So yeah, we do that a lot.
So I'm going to shift gears here a little bit and talk about this canine culture, what it's not. And one of the things that the very first thing on there was talking about canine not being an adjunct duty. Now, I know some agencies are kind of feel like they're forced in that position. So I want to throw this out to some of the people I suspect among the panel that have worked with agencies where canine is an adjunct duty. So talking about, I know John and Mark and Melinda and Don have all trained smaller agencies, help with training for smaller agencies that may not have the resources that the big agencies that paid them to do this on a daily basis had. How do we help agencies address this canine as an adjunct duty thing, where it's like they spend the bulk of their time just shagging calls like everybody else, and then when something that needs a dog is there, then you've got a dog and you go do that? What are the ups and downs of that, pros and cons?
I guided it for years. And I was fortunate enough to have supervisors that understood my role, not only as an officer and then as a sergeant, but then a canine handler on top of all that, able to work that through with them, where they understood that I wasn't always going to be where I needed to be if I was going to be assigned to work a specific area and have to stay there. So I was fortunate enough to have them understand that for me to be as proactive as I needed to be able to respond with dog to any call that came in, they were willing to work with me on that, even though I was a small agency, to put me in somewhat of a, no pun intended, rover position, so that I could virtually go to any dog call that came up. I was lucky that I had command staff that understood that. And because the public funded the dog, I'm not going to say I used it, but I did. I used that as hey, I need to be available to use this dog at every opportunity that I can. So it worked out real well for me in that regard.
I have a comment. For us, for those who don't know, I came from St. Paul, Minnesota PD. We started with small amount of dogs, and then when I retired, we had 23. So in the beginning, when the dogs were needed, we found that when you were getting calls that you just can't break away from some calls. You got to stay there because you're the only person. So they worked it out over time that we were pressed to back up everybody. If you weren't on a call, you were backing somebody up. But with the idea that if you initiated something, it was yours to finish. Otherwise, you were assisting other officers on the street with calls. Now, we had quite a few dogs at the time. We could have as many as 10 working the street at night. That's big for St. Paul. So we were like, we were all assigned a certain area of the town that we were responsible for, but we could leave those areas to assist others. And so we were kind of like a mobile SWAT team, maybe a little much, but like a mobile SWAT team in the city. And so that's how it worked for us. Thank you.
I think, John, you were going to say something? Or no? Did I see
No,
that?
I think it was covered.
Mark, you got anything to throw in on that? Okay.
I would just add that, and I was lucky enough to be, as I moved up the ranks and keeping the dog, as you mentioned, but I was able to talk to other counties or other places that we would go at a supervisor's level, letting them know that we're available, but also we abide by our policy regardless of where we go. So if we got called into another county or another city, that they would understand that we were going by our policy. And just something that Don said and a little bit about what John said is that we talk about that the supervisors need to know policy. To me, it was important that all supervisors in my agency knew policy. It's too easy for other supervisors to, as they're reviewing policy or reading policy, to go, well, that belongs to the canine supervisor. I don't even need to read this because they're going to deal with it. So it's important that other supervisors need to learn that too.
Yeah. And here's the thing. I think that the canine unit has to be proactive about getting those other supervisors up to speed. You can't rely on them and just say, hey, you need to know this. I think involving them in training, asking, hey, can you set up some ad hoc training in their sector, and then ask them, can you come and help with a role play on this? And by the way, here's the policy that applies and all that good stuff, is one way to get that in there. We've got a comment in here from USPCA Region 13 says, I think with smaller or adjunct duty, supervision plays a huge role in that being the adjunct duty issue. But smart, good decision-making is a must, and you have to be willing to be able to tell supervisors the things you can and can't do, because most, at least at smaller departments, don't know the policies and regulations. So I'm looking for some clarification on that. I'd like to address this notion, because small agencies have, by definition, fewer resources than a larger one. And so the need for that officer to handle calls is important, as Melinda described. At the same time, the need for the dog's training to be maintained and for the handler to be prepared to handle canine calls are both important also. So how do we help small agencies with this conundrum? As the people who've been in larger agencies, how much support did you provide to smaller agencies in terms of training and guidance? Maybe when a handler for a small agency, hey, I'm having a rough time, were you able to advocate for them or give them a model that they could take back that would work?
So with us, we do have several smaller agencies surrounding us, and we have, especially since Eric has been so involved with the USPCA, we're a lot more accessible, I believe, to the smaller agencies, and we have an open door. Look, if you want to come train with us, just let us know, and you can come on a Wednesday. That's when we train, and we'll train. And we've done that a lot. There's one particular agency that comes pretty regularly, actually two, that come pretty regularly to our training. And they oftentimes do need help with some. They don't have the same resources we have, obviously, and we're happy to share that. I know we've shared our policy with several of them. Here's our policy. You don't have to, obviously write it the exact same way. It may not be applicable to everything you do, but here's what our policy is. We also have a tactical operation guideline with canine section in it that you're more than welcome to look at. And we have canine manual that's, I don't know, like 50 pages. So we have all kinds of written stuff, and we're more than willing to share it with any agency that wants to, really. So that's how we approach it.
Do you find that any of those agencies have a report to you that their own agencies won't cut them loose to come to that training?
Often, yes. That's a good point, Steve. That it's not them always not wanting to train or not. I think a lot of people do want to train. I think they want to learn. They don't have the support, so to speak, like Melinda was saying. She had the support, it sounds like, which is great. And I think, we're so reactive. It's almost like something has to happen before we allow things. So if these administrators at these smaller agencies understood how important canine is, I think it was Lou talking about how under the microscope we are. I can't remember, maybe it was John, about how it was John. He said you can't pick a canine like you do a detective because we have this use of force. We can be sued. There's all kinds of consequences that can come from poor handling or just simply not knowing not knowing when I can use the dog, when I can't use the dog. Is this appropriate? Is this not appropriate? So it's almost like I said, something bad has to happen, and then maybe they would consider that. But if you're going to have a dog in your agency, that needs to be a really top priority as far as training and education. And I let them go train, but I understand a lot of places don't. And again, a lot of places around us, they won't cut them loose to do it.
Have you seen any repercussions from that? Have you seen have either a bad event at one of those agencies that hadn't been able to attend training, or that they eventually came to you with a problem that probably would have been easier to fix earlier on?
The first one, no, luckily not yet. I mean,
Good.
you're right. It's a matter of time though, right? The second one, yes, they come. Usually by the time they come to us, it's because they're having some sort of issue that they just don't know how to solve. They need more help, and I totally get that. But again, we're more than happy to do it. And it's the same reason we're doing these webinars and that we have the best practices working group, because we want to be able to help people and we want to have the best canines out there that we can have. So yes, Steve, to your question, many times when they do come to us, it's because they've already had several problems. It's not at the beginning, it's always years into it when they've been having problems or whatever that they hope we can help them with.
Okay. Go ahead, Gene.
As I listen to everything that's being said, it strikes me that canine is really a microcosm of what's going on in your entire organization. Everything we're talking about can be expanded to everything. Yesterday, I had a meeting with the chief of police. He's hiring my team to come in and do an assessment. So I'm looking at my notes. What he wants us to review: pursuits, role of the supervisor, after action reports, use of force, the supervisor's role in evaluating use of force, and the use of force review going all the way to the chief executive so everybody knows what's going on in that particular unit. What's their culture? what are best policies, best practices to implement in this agency. So that's one chief looking at his entire organization. What we're talking about today applies to the entire organization. So what we do in Canine is going to impact probably every other unit in that organization as well. Just have to move it over, change a couple names, and our best practices could probably help other units within an organization as well. That's my 2 cents.
Go for it, Don.
I think it just needs to be pointed out that no matter what supervisor is on the scene, whether it's a canine supervisor or another supervisor, they are in charge of the scene. They need to know what the capabilities are, what the canine should be doing, not be doing, and be able to call off everything or stop it as if he sees fit. I mean, there are many cases where supervisors are there, but they say, "Oh, I don't know that much about canine, but go ahead. If you need to stop, but just do what you do, thing." You can't do that anymore. I mean, you fall as the sergeant in charge. And the case I'm specifically thinking about was somebody as an acting sergeant. He got involved. So that's important. My 2 cents. Thank you.
Just quickly, we trained a lot of outside agencies that were adjunct. In other words, they worked patrol and they used their canine when they were needed. And a lot of times people would come into our school through a trainer. So a cop in another agency knew a cop in our agency who introduced them to the trainer. And there was never a lot of communication other than like a letter of authorization between command staff or mid-level supervision of the other agency and ours. So what I ended up doing is before we could take somebody else in from an outside agency, I would always reach out to a chief, depending upon the size of the agency, or a lieutenant or captain or whoever who was in charge of the unit, and just have a casual conversation with them about what they wanted to accomplish through that. And I would ask the questions: do you have a canine policy? If you do, I need to know what it is, because that's how we're going to train your guy too. A lot of times I got a lot of blank dead air on the other side of the phone. And I think that's the nature of our industry right now. There's a lot of people that want canines in the street, but don't want to go through the necessary work to make them work smoothly. So I would ask to be part of their selection process, to sit on a panel if they had one. A lot of agencies didn't have panels. And that kind of was a cue to me that might be an issue for the unit in the future. We would do things, we would have them come in, but one of the most important things that I found was when somebody did come in and they were in our school and we were happy with them and we paired them with a dog, or they tried to pair their own dog, and we overlooked that because sometimes they didn't even understand how a dog is paired on a new unit. One of the things that we tried to do is get the supervisor of that handler involved, have him show up at classes, have him observe what was going on to see what was happening. Because a lot of times, either supervisors that were already canine supervisors or not, we brought them in to let them know and see what we were doing. And we also made them show up for classrooms. And listen, I have to be honest, my experience, and I can only speak from my experience, 50% of the people that we tried to get involved, the canine supervisors that were not full-time canine supervisors in smaller agencies, were so busy they didn't have time to come. And I understood this. I'm not saying it's a good best practice, but I understand that they just have so much on their plate they couldn't show up. And to me, that was the beginning of the failure of the unit. And that's the kind of things that's part of our culture right now, is we have the supervisors, whether they be a part-time supervisor of the unit or a full-time supervisor unit, we give them so much to do as command staff and executive leadership. These guys are running around the clock and don't have time to delve into the problems and try to fix them all the time. And we can talk about it on here, and it's very important that we do, but we need to reach out to executive leadership too, and let them understand how important and critical having these people involved in being able to solve problems is. This isn't a part-time gig. This is a full-time thing, unless you want to, have a lot of work for your risk management company, in the agency. But this can be good. And when then things go bad and we have a bad deployment, it not only hurts that agency, it hurts the county agency, it hurts the state agency, it hurts the whole country. We all suffer. And you know, the reason we're all on this program is because no one's getting paid. At least if I am, I haven't gotten a paycheck yet. But we're all here to make Canine better. You know, that's the whole point. We came here to try to help Canine. There's no ulterior motive here. We're just trying to help other handlers, and especially agencies in general. That whole chain, that we can make this better for them, so that they have a unit that really works well, that really has good outcomes. And you know what? When they run a press story on that, it gets accolades. Not like, oh, and send shiver up your spines. We need people to look at what we do and like what we do. Thank you.
So, John, this kind of leads me into the next piece where I wanted to go with this in keeping with the presentation, because we talked about what makes a good canine officer. And I realized as I look at this slide right now, it could have been better, because we talked about, you know, that professional, judicious, and ethical good cop. But what is it that separates a good canine officer from every other good cop? What do you, the best canine officers you've seen in your career, what do you see as the hallmark, and how did it get there? How did they change from just being a good cop to being the canine officer that everybody wanted showing up if they got shot? They wanted their dog looking for the guy that shot them, or the guy that you never worried about at a community meeting or on a hot call.
Well, his characteristics are probably something we're all familiar with, so I'm not going to get into that. But I think it's very important we realize this. Over the course of years, I probably interviewed over 500 handlers for positions. And I can state this unequivocally, and it probably applies to other units as well. What you have as a patrol officer is exactly what you're going to have as a canine officer. It doesn't change. All of his good attributes and characteristics that made him a good cop can make him a great canine officer. But if he did not have them as a cop, he's not going to just pick them up in canine. It doesn't work like that. You can have somebody wanting to get into unit and promise everything that they're going to do this, that, and the other thing. But if they want a proactive, good decision-making cop, they're not going to be a proactive, good decision canine handler. And that's a fact.
So I get that. I get the idea that the baseline of the base product stays that good, professional, judicious, ethical cop. At the same time, there's got to be a little something that adds on to this that makes the good canine officer. And I'm going to throw this out. Somehow they have to be willing to commit to this in a way that was described earlier. You know, this is a 24/7, 365 thing. You're with that dog. You spend more of your waking hours with your dog than you do with your spouse. And so as a result of that, you need somebody that provides the balance, that, you know, that intense passion for the canine side, for the dog side, but can also balance that and not burn themselves out. So how do we do that as a cultural piece? Because really good units, I've seen really good units fall apart because the best people burned themselves out and they were linchpins. And so they didn't do the thing that we were talking about before with succession planning and a variety of other things. But at some point, somebody should have been able to step in and say, hey, I'll take some of this load for you, or you need to dial it back. How do we get that sweet spot of commitment to canine from an already good cop that makes them an excellent canine handler?
I wish I could give you a one-word answer, but it really comes down to anything that happens here. You need good leadership from the top that affects the unit. If you don't have a lieutenant above that person, or a captain, or whatever rank, out looking and leading his men and recognizing those facts that this guy is getting burned out. Because if he's not, then he's not in touch with those people. If he's not doing that, then he's not doing his job. It's hard to save somebody who's burning out because maybe their wife will talk to them, maybe a coworker will talk to them, maybe they'll realize they have to reset, which is all good stuff. But it's important that a leader, somebody in supervision above him, look at him and go, hey, there's something going on here. We got to talk about it. We got to figure out how to fix it. Yeah, and you're not fixing it in one day, but you have to be able to recognize it. If you can't recognize it from a peer or from another supervisor, it's never going to get fixed. And I think we always like to go to the go-to guy, if you know who that is. You know, we'll give him it. He'll do it. He's great. He gets everything done for us. And then, you know, oh, listen, that's a good thing to do. We'll have John do that, or we'll have Bob do that. And it's the same guy over and over and over again. And pretty soon he's carrying the world. And it's up to the people above him to recognize that and distribute this a little more evenly. Because let's be honest, we're police officers. There are some of us that don't like to do heavy lifting. Let's be honest. It's that person exists out there, as it does probably with plumbers and construction workers and everywhere else. But I can only speak from my own experience. So it's up to that guy who's in charge of the unit to recognize what the heck's going on here and then have a good plan how to fix it.
Mark, you got anything you want to throw in on that?
I really like what Sergeant Watkins just wrote into the comments, and that's what I would capitalize on, is the person that endorses the lifestyle of canine and gives that extra effort when nobody's looking. The person that'll train on their own, they'll go out and train on their own. I think that is just super important, to be able to be the guy that, as you stated, when you as a supervisor calls me, that you know that I'm going to do the job. You know that I'm going to stay within policy. You don't even have to question, is this what's going to happen? So I think that's super important, what Sergeant Watkins just wrote.
I'm going to get to you, Chris. I got a question for Gene. And Gene, as somebody who's had a lot of canine cops coming through your door when lawsuits have been filed, you know that a lot of those lawsuits, they have some merit and a lot of them don't. And a lot of people perform to a high level, but the lawsuits still happen and others didn't. Do you see a common thread in a cultural component in the ones that made it easy for you to defend them because they were meticulous in their canine craft or in their meticulous in their application of policy?
My best or most successful cases are with my handlers have demonstrated they're hardworking by assisting me in preparing for the defense. In other words, they're willing to go that extra mile. So kind of like what John said, there's just good cops to begin with. They became good canine handlers because they have the attributes of being smart, 2, wanting to win, 3, willing to put in the extra work that it takes to win that lawsuit. And I think I can look at the cases where SWAT or handlers, those that really were always there when I needed them, put in the extra work, let's prep, versus those like, hey, I don't have time, I'm too busy with other stuff. Okay, fine, we'll do the best we can. You can tell which cases are going to be more successful than others. And then also those agencies, in fact, I just got an email right now, a department wants me to review their canine policy, which is good. Every year or two, you should be reviewing those policies. So those agencies that keep up to date with their policies and staying abreast of what's going on out there give me the best chance to defend them, as opposed to those agencies that are relying on a policy that's 10 years old, expecting me to pull a rabbit out of a hat when life has changed and tactics have changed and the law has changed. So yes, what a department does before they get to me determines how successful we're going to be afterwards.
So that being the case, and maybe Chris will touch on this because he raised his hand on this topic. How can we as supervisors develop a culture in our unit that is about that commitment to lifestyle. Because, you know, Sergeant Watkins and USPCA Region 13 are in agreement with what Mark said, that this is people committed to doing the extra work, and there is extra work associated with his job. So how do we as supervisors make that an integral part of the person, as opposed to something they got to do? You got anything on that, Chris?
Well, I think as a supervisor, you just kind of already nurture that culture, because if you got your experienced guys, the guys you're talking about, the guys that maybe are your trainers that do the extra work when you're not looking, and you can rely on them for anything. Which by the way, what I was going to say earlier is you kind of need to, as a supervisor, watch that too, because you can lean on them maybe a little too much and burn them out. So
I've made that mistake myself.
Yeah, and I've caught myself. Hey, man, don't ask somebody else. Don't ask him again. But I think you nurture it by the way the guys with seniority in the squad, the way they are. That culture is already there with them. So you show that that's what you support, and hopefully the younger guys pick up on that, and they're like, okay, this is what the supervisors want. This is what they appreciate. And then again, also being around them a lot. Again, the lieutenant and I are around our guys a lot. The ones we don't see maybe as much, we see them on those Wednesdays, and we're always talking and communicating. So I think to me, that's the best way to support it, is through your other guys that are established, that have been there a while, that the other guys can look up to.
Okay, got it. Anybody else got anything on there? So I think we got two more components of this that I'd like to touch on really quickly before we start wrapping it up. You know, we've talked about roles that everybody from the executive on down about, and how important it is for support on that stuff. So I think that's pretty well addressed. But this kind of goes back. Maybe the kids in Lou's class were onto something, because the first question they had was about how policy differs from law, and how this folds into the culture piece. And if you go back to the outline that we had, you know, not only but policies, but operational goals, procedures, how things were accounted. There's an accountability structure, and succession planning, and a commitment to improvement through training. So that being said, if you consider those as kind of building blocks for this, now I know if there's anybody from HR listening, they're going to want to slap my wrist for saying this right now. But do you, as a canine leader, have an accountability system that goes above and beyond the departments for making sure that you people hold themselves to an even higher standard than patrol? Or is there anybody that's not willing to admit it right now because they know HR will give them a bad time?
Steve, could you give an example of that, or what you mean by it?
So years ago, we had a ceramic statue of a female dog and two puppies at her feet. And she was a piggy bank, had a slot in her back, you could put money in it. You showed up late to roll call, you had to put some money in the piggy bank. If you you didn't take care of your kennels, money in the piggy bank. We had things there. And that money in the piggy bank went for our annual banquet that we would put together to host, to celebrate and build camaraderie together. And it was a pretty powerful tool, not because you spent the money, but because you had to make the payment. It was about the fact that this was there. We fell short. And we all did this. And you would see people roll in late, and before they wouldn't, nobody'd say anything to them. They'd walk in, walk straight to that statue and put the money into it. I won't, and it was called paying the, you fill in the blank. You'd walk in, drop your money in, and wouldn't, and everybody knew that was what was expected. We did that. See, another thing that went above it on accountability. So our department has a pretty specific, or had a pretty thorough and specific use of force review process where all uses of force would go to a use of force unit for, and then canine deployments, canine bites were automatically selected to go to the full use of force review board. And they would come with a finding, yay or nay, was this within policy? Yay or nay, was it legal, etc. But our own internal review was there a better way? Were there different, so we would engage in decision point analysis. In debriefing, we'd look at, here's point A, you could have done B or C. You chose B, what was the likely outcome of C? And we'd go through that all the way through the process. And people would have to defend their answers. And that was something that was different than what was expected of you. And you had to give rationale, the tactical reason why you did something. How did it fit with our department tactics? How did it fit with best procedures that we wanted? Things like that. So debriefings are a huge piece of an accountability model, because the department may find it there, but we say we can do better. Anybody else got another piece of that they want to throw out?
Well, Steve, I think I talked about this earlier, is what you just said, is we debrief every bite, just about every bite, or even some no bite apprehensions to see how we could have done it better. We're since I've been back in the unit, all of our bites have been found within policy, but that does not mean that it was done the best way either. I mean, just because it falls into policy doesn't mean it couldn't have been done better, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So yes, we're always trying to figure out how can we be better constantly. Also, canine within our department is considered a specialty unit. So when you're in a specialty unit, you can be removed at any time for no reason. We could say, hey, you're out. There is no grievance process. It's not part of the contract. It's totally separate from, say, getting removed from the police department. That's a whole nother thing. But we could tomorrow say you're out of the unit because we're just not happy with you, and they can't do anything about it. I think there's good and bad with that, but I think the good being it keeps you accountable. I mean, you want to be the best you can be. If you like your spot, it'll keep you on your toes. Like, okay, I want to be the best canine handler. You should want to anyways, but that's an extra incentive. I'm going to be the best I can be. I'm not going to give them a reason to ever get rid of me. So I think things like that can really help with the accountability.
I like that. It's foreign to me because I worked in Seattle, in an agency with a very strong union. Every movement in the department was done according to a contract. Every movement out of a unit had to be done that way. There were a lot of I's dotted and T's crossed before something could happen like that. But I think there's a piece of this that has to go beyond just what you can do because you can. And that's where we get this. And maybe the succession planning piece, because I tell you, one of the things that I really like about this was having 2 or 3 people who could step in and take my job without missing a beat. Gave me great comfort, but also it gave them commitment. They were committed to making sure they were up to speed with everything that needed to be done at my level, and that meant they had to be good at what they did and then more. So that for me is a huge tool that a good supervisor can leverage if they want to. want to open it up and have a quick Q&A. All right. So to any of the attendees, if you got a question, let's go ahead and bring it up. I'm going to go back to what USPCA Region 13 said before. And he talked when we were talking about supervision and handlers being willing and able to push back on supervisors about what they can and can't do. Just have some of those conversations that can be uncomfortable at sometimes. And then he added on, I guess what I mean is that it can be supervision specific, even down to the specific shift, how much canine means to you, them, and about being support. So what do we want to do to help those small agencies that have an adjunct duty or something like that, or even a larger agency where there's some misconceptions elsewhere in the department about what canine can and can't do for them? How do you create handlers who can comfortably stand for what canine brings to the table and also tell you this is outside the scope of our duties? How do you build that into your people? I'm going to go back to say scenario-based training is the key. And debriefs. Finding out what did and didn't work during debriefs, then creating scenarios around those training scenarios, around those findings from debriefs, is what keeps you constantly staying fresh and keeps everybody understanding their strengths and limitations. And then they can have that conversation with confidence. Anybody got anything else they want to throw on that?
Scenario-based training is only as good as you parallel it to your policy.
Right.
In other words, I can do scenario-based training all day long just because it's nice, right, and it's convenient.
Absolutely.
If it's not in the guardrails of that policy, it's no good. So I go back to the policy again. The policy has to be understandable by people in the unit. It has to be readable, understandable, and drilled into a classroom scenario during initial training. And also, once you get the knowledge base in the initial training and your basic training, then you can pretty much, through muscle memory, make that work on the outside through your scenario training. So I think that that's important. We can have a policy, but I've seen, and I'm sure you guys have too, seen some policies that we can barely understand, or we have to read 7 times and we still have 4 different meanings to it. So a clear current policy is imperative to have scenario-based training that's good for the unit. That's the only thing I want to do.
Okay. I 100% agree with you, because I just operated under the assumption that the debriefs were built around were viewed through the lens of policy. So I'm glad you added that. That's really
best
important.
Practices, yes, I agree with you, but I think we have a lot of units still running around under culture policy rather than real policy, and that's where we get into trouble. That's where we read about it in the newspapers.
Yeah, well, that's what Monell claims are all about, right, Gene? All right. Derek had to leave us because he had another meeting. But Cooper, Bridget, Dwayne, and USPCA Region 13, have you got any questions you want to throw to the group? In that case, I'm going to quickly remind everybody that we have our USPCA Best Practices Working Group 5-year plan to finish crafting and present to you in November. And as we go through this, I'd like to thank the members of the United States Police Canine Association Best Practices Working Group, some of which could not be with us, but you'll see the list here. And it's a nice blend of people who've been doing this a long time and people who are fresh on the job right now. I'm ecstatic that we had this opportunity to talk about something that's really important to me, and that is building an effective canine culture. Don, do you have anything to wrap it up with?
I think it was pretty interesting, some of the things we got into today. Probably caused a few questions from our guests. and even a couple from myself. But I thought it was pretty productive. And a reminder to those, if this is your first foray into the USPCA Best Practices Working Group webinars, we have 3 more webinars that came before this supervision. We have devoted this year to the year of the supervisor. So thank you all for coming. Appreciate everything that you do, and thank you.
All right. Appreciate that, Don. All right. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we are done. This wraps up another USPCA Best Practices Working Group panel discussion that we will see you. Oh, wow. In November, right? Yes, November. Thank you very much, everybody.